Ladies and gentlemen, I am Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It is September 30th, 2022, and we are going to be taking a look, and we're going to ask, is it officially too late for the Russian soldiers in Lyman? Let's get into it. Okay, so when we look at the battlefield, we can see, again, there have been some fairly significant changes, most notable of which is that Ukrainian forces have seized Yampil. You can see, right, as of yesterday, a lot more territory, and Russians have actually done a tremendous amount of withdrawing. Ukrainian forces have either seized or Russian forces have withdrawn from the Seversky Donetsk here, and now they are sitting controlling large portions of the northern bank of the Seversky Donetsk. Yampil has been liberated. And you can see that basically Russian forces have a tiny narrow strip off of Lyman where they can withdraw, but they haven't. They either their command is so broken that they're unable to give a formal withdrawal order or effect a meaningful retreat. Because again, retreat is more than just packing up and going home. Someone needs to hold these lines, and you have to have a plan for some units to leave, establish a combat position. Then your units that are holding the front need to start to systematically withdraw, often under fire. It's very complicated, and it requires planning and careful distribution of orders. And the fact that this is, one, a fairly abrupt seizure of a significant amount of territory, and two, the fact that now, if you want to withdraw from Lyman, you have no choice. You have to go through the 0528 highway, which at its narrowest looks to be maybe 2 kilometers from the Ukrainian front lines. This is a huge problem. 2 kilometers, easily within range of even a heavy machine gun or medium machine gun, certainly comfortably within it, for an artillerist, it's like shooting fish in a barrel. But they need to be able to get their entire defensive force through this very narrow passageway. A really tall order at the best. I actually believe the rumors that Putin has given a no-step backward order means that Russian forces will remain in Lyman. The problem here is that if Ukrainian forces can cut off this highway, which there's not really any geographic reason they can't, then they will encircle Lyman and simply wait probably a week while the forces run. They have no resupply, so Russians will run out of water, then they'll run out of food, and then they'll run out of ammunition. And then you hope that they just surrender, realizing that their command has totally abandoned them, or they will fight the Ukrainians in a one-sided battle of annihilation. Because of course, if you're dying of thirst, the chances of you being able to put up a real meaningful fight, even if you've been dug into a place like Lyman and had a long time to do it, chances are not that great. You also hope that the low morale just means that these guys will realize that their command has totally abandoned them, left them here, and that they'll just surrender to Ukrainians. Especially if they consume Western media, they may know that as a condition of receiving Western aid, Western governments generally do not want to be complicit in war crimes. So a condition of most military aid now is that you strictly do not commit violations of the law of war. Russia can't really claim the same. They are receiving aid from almost nobody, and what military gear they're able to buy on the open market doesn't really come with that many strings attached. That's probably why you've seen a lot more law of war violations. But you may notice that I have, even just as important is to the north, you can see that the beachhead linking Dvorichna and the Kupiansk bridgeheads have officially been linked up, creating a single large front where Ukrainian forces control, I would say most at this point, of the eastern bank of the Oskil. And this is huge because, well, just look, if you're a Ukrainian and you're holding this bridgehead, you are basically fighting the Russians on 3 sides, right? Now, when you link up, you can see the same forces are fighting the Russians only on 2. And having a single unified front means that now they can all of this can become a mutually supporting backfield, right? You can move troops and supplies to shore up areas, to redistribute ammunition. You can create a single like medical center, a single cache for everyone along this front. It's hugely easier when you have a unity across the front, in addition to just the geography, right? Look, it's hard. The enemy is probably not going to flank them if one flank is blocked by the Osceola Reservoir, the other one blocked by the Osceola River, and there's a single unbroken line of troops all around the rest of it. Also significant is that the Ukrainians now control 1, 2, possibly even 3 major river crossings. Now, are they all intact? That's not clear, but they're intact enough that some number of forces were able to get across. So you hope now that they can really start to bring men and material through these 3 major thoroughfares, bringing more combat power to bear on this front that Russia was probably hoping would remain stable for at least a while. And what I think we may see is, obviously, after the encirclement of Lyman, the next target may be this Borova. And the reason I say that is because, well, you guys can see it looks like it's almost ready for encirclement itself, right? Russians are going to have to rob forces here to effect the Lyman withdrawal, meaning that Borova may end up being weaker. But, Russians look at the same map we do, and they may, if there's any combat power available, try to reinforce Borova. At this point, you may have noticed that I've just started to feel bad for the Russians, and I have a lot of sympathy for them. And when we look at Institute for the Study of War's discussion of the partial mobilization, we can see why. The failure, they call them systemic failures, even though the Kremlin is blaming them on the Russian bureaucracy. These bureaucracies, they make mistakes, but once guidance is clarified, they usually do the right thing. Even Putin has acknowledged that they've mobilized men with no military experience, sending servicemen to the wrong specializations, i.e. a cook driving a tank, and mobilizing men with health conditions or large families. This is, of course, a terrible for the Russian information and for the morale of the Russians. But what is interesting to me is that there's also reports that these men are being mobilized. Right? Putin claims that this is some sort of big mistake, but the reality is I think this is operating exactly the way that the Russian government needs it to. They understand that the reality is that individuals, reservists with combat experience, they've been mobilized for months. They were probably mobilized on the initial invasion. So now they're talking about mobilizing reservists or people with combat experience or who've completed their training. No, none of them are like that. Those people are long gone. They have no choice but to go with those who would otherwise be medically disqualified, those with no military experience, etc. But there are also rumors coming from the Ukrainian military that Russian forces have committed at least some mobilized men to Kharkiv who told Ukrainian forces they received no training prior to their deployment on September 15th. That is incredibly worrying for Russia and a sign of perhaps their desperation. Institute for the Study of War actually thinks that it is because Putin is directly coordinating with commanders who are begging for troops. But you honestly, at this point, I hope that these untrained, you can't even call them soldiers, civilians in a uniform, are surrendering to Ukrainian forces as soon as they possibly can. And I say this not as like a Ukraine stan where I'm like, oh, yeah, Russians should surrender. I mean it literally, like as someone who commanded troops in combat. If you were to do that, like take a civilian and put them in a uniform and give them an M4 and send them to Afghanistan to my unit, we would take their weapon from them, sit them down, and be like, we're going to find you a way out of here. Because an untrained soldier, right, they're not going to hit, they can barely operate their weapon. They can't hit anything. They can't do medical treatment. They can't talk on the radio. Not only are they useless, but then they're going to eat the food, drink the water, use the ammunition of soldiers who actually can engage targets and are properly trained. So just the idea that you're sending this incredibly low caliber of troop to the front, you just assume that it'll be like a sieve, that they'll just filter into the front and surrender to Ukrainian forces as soon as possible. Now, again, Putin seems to claim that all of these mobilization errors are mistakes, but we'll turn it over to Ground.News. Ground.News is a service that lets us see as the same story is covered across the political spectrum. Check the link in the description to try them out for free. And I think this story is really interesting because it says, so if your bureaucracy cannot run the existing draft offices, right, as Putin claims that the existing draft offices are making terrible mistakes recruiting all these people who shouldn't have been recruited, but then you go and open more border draft offices of people who are fleeing, then why would you expand a system that's already broken? The answer is, of course, that the system isn't actually broken, that they're almost certainly following the exact guidance of the Kremlin, and that the Kremlin is pretending like it somehow doesn't control its Ministry of Defense, which is increasingly preposterous. And I think even the Ukrainians or the Russians are probably realizing the absurdity of all this. And you can see here that across the spectrum, right, center sources, high factuality are all repeating this story. It just says, it's just an indicator of exactly what's really going on here, which is Russia is furious that its able-bodied men are leaving, and it wants very much to get them into uniform and into the front lines as fast as possible, even though, as we've seen, Russia can't logistically support its existing army. It couldn't support the forces that push towards Kiev. So why on earth do we think it's going to be able to logistically support these totally untrained troops? I think it's basically impossible. Anyway, guys, that is all I had for you. Thank you so much for joining me on this update. Of course, if you want the combat video breakdowns that YouTube has started to crack down on, these are the helmet cam footage, leaked, combat TikToks. I do all those breakdowns on the Patreon. The link is in the description. So be sure to become a Patreon member today. And thanks so much to my Lieutenant tier patrons. You guys make this whole thing possible. I'll see you guys in the next one.